Demon's Souls. It's the game that started it all when it comes to the Souls series, and the likely cause of thousands of broken controllers around the world. Having been remastered for the PS5, it's back again, so let's see how it holds up. The Souls series has always had a very unique, albeit crude art style. The monsters were horrifying, and the various locales were nothing short of dreadful. But the games never really looked modern. Something about them always felt dated, but that was okay because they were never about the graphics. Demon's Souls for PS5 basically says screw that. Why not offer great gameplay and look good while doing so? What they've achieved here is a true remaster, and it allows for a game that originally launched back in 2009 to feel like a legitimate next-gen experience. The difference between this and the original Demon's Souls, or even Sekiro's visuals for that matter, is night and day. There's no more of that greasy shine that Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 suffered from. And while a game like Sekiro was able to do away with that as well, I don't think it quite got the lighting or atmosphere right. Demon's Souls does, and to such an extent that I wouldn't blame you for thinking you were in the mines of Moria, with a Balrog about to emerge from around the corner in one of the game's underground levels. Obviously, this is not Lord of the Rings, but it's still pretty impressive when a game is able to achieve that level of visual awe. The eerie atmosphere in this game is nothing short of incredible thanks to effects like the lighting and volumetric fog. Then you mix those with some of the game's breathtaking set pieces like a fire-breathing dragon, and you end up with some pretty mind-blowing moments. While the character and boss design has remained pretty faithful to the original models, it's also seen some wonderful improvements that make dealing with these monstrosities that much more terrifying. Seriously, the difference between this and the 2009 version is like comparing the Scorpion King to the monsters in a Guillermo del Toro film. In terms of its world space, this remaster also makes phenomenal use of tessellation, which helps give surfaces some real depth and prevents environments from looking like a series of flat textures like they did in the original. Some really impressive work here graphics-wise. On top of the visuals, the soundtrack has also been updated quite a bit to match the tone of some of the more recent Souls games. And while there are probably some older fans who will still prefer the original version, having listened to both, I think this one is much better. In fact, across the board, sound design is far superior to the original, which really helps to elevate the whole experience to a level that simply wasn't possible back in 2009. Having a dragon swoop down to scorch the earth in front of you, or a giant knight hurl a blast of energy in your direction, makes for some really cool moments thanks to that sound design. Animations for the combat in Demon's Souls have also been completely redone, and in general, combat has a fantastic amount of weight to it. Every time you roll out of the way of an enemy attack, or manage to land a hit of your own, there's a sense of heftiness to it that changes depending on what type of gear you have on, or what kind of enemy you're facing. And on top of that player feedback, the level of realism adds an even greater sense of danger. Though I will note that the biggest danger can sometimes be the camera angle, especially when you're facing any of the smaller enemies whose attacks can end up hidden from view by your own character. It's also worth mentioning that while combat is very smooth, some of the enemy AI can actually feel a bit wonky at times, specifically when it comes to monsters like the gargoyles and man centipedes. Nothing terrible, but it is noticeable. That said, I did feel like I had far fewer moments in this where I felt cheated compared to other From Software titles. And what I mean by that is, if you die, 99% of the time it's because of a mistake you made, rather than a boss twisting around in midair to land a cheap shot on you, simply because that's what his animation dictated. Speaking of bosses, for each one of its 5 worlds, Demon's Souls offers a number of worthwhile boss fights that provide as much intrigue as they do a challenge when it comes to figuring out their strengths and weaknesses. In fact, one of my favorite boss fights was actually the very first one, simply because of how unique it was. You gotta remember that this was the very first game in the Souls series, so while they may not be as refined as the bosses in some of the later titles, at the very least, they are pretty creative. Now, I should clarify, that doesn't mean they're all as entertaining as they could be. As a matter of fact, there are a few boss fights that are fairly underwhelming, like the Adjudicator or Dragon God, who essentially boils down to blowing up a few rocks, rather than facing the dragon itself. And though I can appreciate that they stuck true to the original, part of me wishes they would have redone a couple of these lackluster boss fights just to make them a bit more enjoyable, and possibly more of a challenge. Now, that's not to say that Demon's Souls is easy by any stretch of the imagination. I actually found most of the mechanics to be a little more punishing than the more recent Soulsborne games. For instance, when you die, you don't just lose souls, you lose a chunk of your vitality too, which you have to kill a demon in order to get back. On top of that, Demon's Souls also lacks any sort of healing potions that replenish when you die. So if you end up using all of your consumables on the way to a boss, and don't end up beating them, chances are your next try will be even harder, especially in locations where enemies don't drop those crucial items. That means that sometimes you may have to do a bit of farming in previous areas. It's also worth noting that unlike Sekiro, there aren't numerous bonfires scattered across the map. If you die, you have to go back to the very beginning of the level. Now, while these different aspects do mean that dying can be extremely punishing, they no doubt make surviving multiple areas and bosses that much more rewarding. And to be fair, most of the levels have a number of shortcuts that you can unlock to make getting back to a boss far less time consuming than it may have been the first time. In general, the level design in this game is really nice. And there's a decent amount of variety too, from the gothic labyrinth that is Boletaria Palace to the desert mines of Stonefang Tunnel. By introducing different enemies and different types of terrain, each of the 5 worlds forces you to change up your playstyle just enough to keep the experience feeling fresh the whole way through. Now, I'll be honest, there were a couple of levels that I thought I hated, like the Tower of Latria, a sort of prison with tight corridors that made fighting the enemies there, who often required a backstab to deal with effectively, extremely frustrating. Or at least, that's how it seemed at first. But I ended up dying so many times during these levels that eventually I began to memorize the layout of each area and learn all of the different enemy patterns, to the point where, in time, I was able to rush through those seemingly slow-paced levels without stopping or running into trouble at all. So I could then move on to focusing all my energy on the boss. And that's basically the Souls series in a nutshell. What may start out as a painful experience eventually becomes strangely enjoyable. And you get this weird sense of accomplishment that has to be some form of Stockholm Syndrome, because I sure as hell have never loved something that's caused me this much pain before. For those curious what Demon's Souls has in terms of story, the narrative here is not all that different from most Soulsborne games. The reality is that it's quite vague and sort of pushed out of focus. That's just how this franchise is. And I know some people like that, and others don't. Personally, I fall somewhere in the middle, but I do really enjoy how many secrets these games have tucked away. For instance, there are a ton of hidden side characters that you can find during your journey, and each one of them has something to offer you either narratively or in the form of unique items. Sometimes you might have to save their life in return for thanks or even help with the boss, and other times you may have to track down a precious trinket for them in exchange for powerful spells or useful equipment. Will you need a guide to figure some of these things out? Probably, but the ambiguity is part of what gives these games their charm. Overall, Demon's Souls is a great example of how to get a remaster right. It manages to stay faithful to the original, while also bringing an experience that debuted back in 2009 up to par with most modern titles. Truth be told, there were many times where I hated this game. Certain levels and certain bosses kicked my ass. But whenever I did finally get through them, I felt an incredible sense of accomplishment and a deep desire to press forward, and that's not something a lot of games can achieve. As a whole, I really enjoyed this experience. But like I mentioned earlier, some of those lackluster boss fights do knock it down a peg, leaving this one at an 8 out of 10 for me. If you're a fan of the Souls series, I do think you should try this out at some point. But I wouldn't go as far as to say that you need to rush out and buy a PS5 just for this title. And with that said, that's going to do it for this review, so thanks for watching. If you end up playing Demon's Souls, let me know what you think down in the comments, and as always, I will see you in the next one.